Imagine trying to ruin your own engagement by showing up in the ugliest dress London has ever survived. Baggy gown 3 sizes too big, thick, clunky glasses, a hairstyle that looks like it lost a duel with a hurricane, because Lady Beatrice Wickham had one mission: make the old, boring suitor run for his life. But what if the man waiting at the table isn't old? What if he doesn't flinch? He smirks. And what if the victim of her sabotage is actually Alistair MacLean, the Duke of Argyll, a man so powerful they whisper he owns half of Scotland? So tell me, how do you scare off a man who's used to fear when you're the only woman who laughs in his face? And if you were B, would you run, or would you marry the devil just to prove you can't be controlled? Stay to the end, because this forced marriage doesn't turn into a love story. It turns into a war of pride, a battle of wit, and a secret threat that could burn their world to the ground. Now, before we dive in, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. Like this video if you love chaotic heroines and dangerously charming dukes. And share it with a friend who would absolutely show up to an engagement looking like a scandal on purpose. London wore its usual mask of refinement, but underneath it breathed smoke, damp stone, and the sweet rot of winter roses dying in overheated rooms. In the Wickham house, the air was thick with beeswax polish and the faint, cruel perfume of starch, linen forced into obedience, just like daughters. Lady Beatrice Wickham stood like a heretic in a cathedral of manners. They had laid the corset on her bed as if it were a necessary prayer. Whalebone ribs, laces like restraints, silk meant to convince the world that a woman's body was a problem to be solved. Beatrice touched it with 2 fingers, as if it might bite. "Your ladyship," a maid murmured, careful and hopeful. "Shall we begin?" Beatrice's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Begin what? My embalming?" The maid blinked. Beatrice softened her tone, only slightly. It wasn't the girl's fault, it was the world's. Downstairs, her father's voice carried through the corridor, polished and absolute. The voice of a man who had never had to negotiate his freedom. Lord Wickham spoke as if announcing the weather rather than a life sentence. Tonight would be the engagement dinner. Tonight, the arrangement would become official. Tonight, she would be displayed like a jewel with a price tag no one bothered to hide. Beatrice pressed her palm to the cold window pane and watched carriages slide through the misty street, their wheels hissing over wet cobblestones. London always sounded like it was whispering secrets. This one was hers. Her father had described the suitor with satisfied contempt for romance. Appropriate, respectable, sensible. An old family friend, likely. A man who would treat her inheritance like a ledger and her opinions like a mild illness. Beatrice had no intention of becoming anyone's sensible triumph. A plan came to her, bright and wicked as a struck match. Not a grand escape, not yet, but sabotage, delicious and immediate. If society insisted on a performance, then she would give them one they could never digest. She turned from the corset as if it were beneath her notice and crossed to her wardrobe. She ignored the gowns that had been chosen for her. Pale, flattering, obedient, her fingers found the one she had once begged to be donated. The dress too large, too heavy, too ridiculous. The fabric hanging like surrendered curtains. Perfect. She added a pair of thick spectacles she'd purchased as a joke, the frames severe enough to make any man think twice about flirting. Then she attacked her own hair with a comb and stubborn creativity until it looked like it had survived a storm, a duel, and a moral lecture, possibly all at once. She studied her reflection. Not ugly, exactly. Worse. Unimpressed. "Your father will be furious," the maid whispered, half terrified, half thrilled. Beatrice leaned closer to the mirror, eyes bright with rebellion. Good. Fury is at least honest. When she descended the staircase, silk dragging in defiant waves, the house seemed to hold its breath. A footman faltered. A maid pressed a hand over her mouth. Somewhere, a clock chimed with the smug certainty of time that belonged to men. Lord Wickham met her at the bottom step. His gaze travelled over her oversized gown, her severe glasses, her unapologetic hair, and the colour drained from his face as if Beatrice had slapped him with a glove made of scandal. "What," he said very softly, "have you done?" Beatrice tilted her head. Sweet as poison. "I dressed for the occasion. You will change." "No," she replied, calm as snowfall. "Tonight, I will be exactly as I am." His jaw tightened. "This is not a game." Beatrice's eyes sharpened. "For you, it isn't. For me, it's my life." A pause stretched between them, thick, brittle, ready to crack. Then the butler announced that the guest had arrived, and the name followed like the edge of a blade. His Grace, the Duke of Argyll. Beatrice's pulse stumbled. A duke. Her father had never mentioned a duke. The doors to the dining room opened. Warmth rolled out. Spiced wine, roast, candle smoke, along with the low hum of polite conversation. Beatrice stepped forward, prepared to watch an old man recoil in horror. Instead, she met the gaze of a tall figure near the hearth, broad-shouldered and still, as if the room had arranged itself around him without permission. Dark hair, a calm face carved from restraint, and eyes the colour of storm water. Cold, watchful, unafraid, young, absurdly so. He looked her over, every inch of defiance, and rather than flinch, his mouth curved. Not a polite smile, not a social one. A smile that said he understood exactly what she was trying to do, and found it entertaining. The room had been trained for pleasant lies, candlelight softened faces, crystal blurred edges, and conversation floated like lace meant to conceal hunger. Yet the moment Beatrice stepped inside, the usual London spell faltered, because the man by the hearth did not look at her the way men looked at women they meant to own. He looked as though he were assessing a storm. His Grace, the Duke of Argyll, stood with a stillness that made everyone else seem restless by comparison, not rigid, controlled, as if even breathing were a choice he could refuse. Around him, the air carried the sharp scent of peat smoke clinging to fine wool, foreign and clean against the city's sweet suffocation. He did not bow too quickly, nor smile too generously. He simply watched, and somehow the watching felt like a hand closing around the room. Beatrice refused the instinct to shrink. She had come armed with ridicule, with deliberate disgrace, with an ugliness designed to offend. She would not let him turn it into a mirror. Lord Wickham recovered first, stepping forward with the brittle warmth of a man who had bet everything on obedience. "Your Grace, an honour beyond measure. My daughter, Lady Beatrice." Beatrice gave the smallest dip of her head. If she curtsied any lower, she might be accused of surrender. The Duke's gaze slid to her spectacles, then to the disastrous tumble of her hair, then to the gown drowning her shoulders like a deliberate insult. A pause, long enough for the room to sharpen its gossiping teeth. Then his mouth tilted. "Lady Beatrice," he said, voice low and even, the sound of restraint with teeth beneath it. "I see you have chosen honesty." A few guests blinked, uncertain whether they'd been complimented or threatened by proxy. Beatrice lifted her chin. I find it saves time. And effort, he added, as if tasting the word. How refreshing. Lord Wickham's expression tightened like a noose being tested. Beatrice moved to her seat with exaggerated clumsiness, letting the heavy fabric drag, letting her sleeve brush too close to a glass. A tiny splash of wine kissed the linen. She pretended not to notice. It was a performance, every misstep a small act of war. The Duke noticed anyway. When he took his place opposite her, the table suddenly felt narrower, as if the distance between them had been negotiated without her consent. The silverware gleamed. The servants poured. Conversation restarted, forced into motion like a carriage with a cracked wheel. Beatrice picked up her fork as though it were a weapon she barely tolerated. "I was told my suitor would be sensible," she said, loudly enough to be impolite and quiet enough to be deniable. Argyle's eyes flickered with amusement. "A dangerous rumour." "Are you sensible, then?" she pressed. He looked at her as though considering the truth for sport. "No." A small laugh escaped someone, quickly strangled into a cough. Beatrice smiled behind her hideous spectacles. "How unfortunate." "On the contrary," he murmured, and the words felt meant for her alone. "It keeps life interesting." Lord Wickham attempted to steer them back onto the rails of propriety. "His Grace has been kind enough to take an interest in my freedom," Beatrice supplied, sweetly. Her father's stare turned murderous. The Duke's hand paused near his glass. "In your spirit," he corrected, smooth as a blade being slid back into its sheath. "Your reputation precedes you, Lady Beatrice." "My condolences," she said. "None needed." His gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "It is rare to meet a woman who does not bloom on command." Beatrice felt heat rise, not in her cheeks, but under her ribs, where indignation lived. "Perhaps I prefer thorns." Argyle's smile sharpened. "I had suspected." Dinner continued, but it was a thin, trembling thing. Polite words stretched over a tension that grew heavier with every exchange. Beatrice threw small provocations like stones. The Duke caught them as if they were gifts. He did not retreat. He did not scold. He simply met her insolence with a calm that made her feel infuriatingly seen. Then a guest across the table leaned toward another, whispering too loudly, too eagerly. "It's him, Argyle. They say he owns half of Scotland." The words slid into the room like smoke. Beatrice's stomach dipped. Half of Scotland was not a husband. It was a kingdom. Argyle's eyes remained on her. "If you wish to frighten me away," he said softly, "you'll need a stronger costume." Beatrice's voice came out steadier than she felt. "And if I wish to frighten myself away?" His gaze darkened with something unreadable. Humour, perhaps, or challenge. "Then, Lady Beatrice, you should start running before you realise I enjoy the chase." After dinner, the Wickham house did not feel like a home so much as a courtroom where the verdict had already been written. The corridors smelled of cooling wax and extinguished candles, and every footstep seemed louder than it should have been, as if the walls were eager to repeat her disobedience. Lord Wickham caught Beatrice before she could vanish upstairs. His hand closed around her wrist, not painful, but claiming. The gesture was worse than force. It was familiarity used as permission. "Enough," he hissed, the word polished into menace. "You embarrassed me in front of a duke." Beatrice looked down at his hand, then back into his face. Her voice remained mild, which was its own kind of cruelty. "You mean I embarrassed the arrangement?" His nostrils flared. This is not some childish rebellion. Do you know what refusing him would mean? It would mean I remain myself, she replied, which, I admit, is inconvenient for men who prefer their daughters folded and stored. His grip tightened. It would mean I will find someone else, someone less amused by your antics. Beatrice's smile thinned. There it was, the threat beneath the fatherhood, not concern, leverage. A shadow fell across the corridor, and with it came that scent again, peat smoke and cold air, as if the Highlands had followed him in. The Duke of Argyll stepped into the lamplight with the unhurried certainty of a man entering property he already owned. "My lord," he said, and the title sounded like a reminder rather than respect. His gaze dropped to Beatrice's wrist. "You are holding her too tightly." Lord Wickham released her at once, smoothing his expression as though he had merely been guiding her. "Your Grace, forgive me. I was only applying pressure," the Duke finished, pleasant enough to be lethal. A common method. Beatrice flexed her fingers, refusing to rub her skin. She would not give her father the satisfaction of proof. Argyll's eyes moved to her face. "Walk with me, Lady Beatrice." It was not a request, yet it was not an order aimed to crush. It was an invitation with steel hidden in velvet. Beatrice tilted her head. "If I say no, then I will stand here," he said, "and your father will continue negotiating with your bones." A cold clarity settled in her chest. Beatrice turned and walked, not because he commanded it, but because she chose the lesser fire. They stopped in a small sitting room, where the air smelled faintly of old books and bergamot tea. The door closed. Silence fell like a curtain. Beatrice spoke first, because she refused to be examined. "I was told I was being sold to a man of advanced age." Argyll's mouth twitched. "I have been accused of many things, but never of being ancient. And yet you arrived like a funeral for my freedom." His gaze held hers, steady as winter water. "I did not come to take your freedom." Beatrice let out a short laugh. "That is the first lie you've told tonight." "No." The Duke stepped closer, stopping at a distance that felt carefully measured. "I came to take your name into mine. There is a difference. A romantic distinction. A practical one." Beatrice's eyes narrowed behind her ridiculous spectacles. "Why?" For the first time, his composure shifted, not breaking, but tightening, as if something beneath it strained against the surface. "Because I need stability," he said quietly. "Because my land is not a drawing room. It has teeth, and when a man grows too powerful, others test whether he bleeds." Beatrice's pulse quickened, annoyed at her own interest. "So you want a duchess like a shield?" "I want a partner," he corrected, and the word sounded strange in his mouth, as if he had rarely used it. "Someone the world cannot easily intimidate." Beatrice stared at him. "You're recruiting." His gaze slid over her disastrous gown, her defiant posture, and returned to her eyes. "Yes," he said, unembarrassed, "and you are uniquely qualified." Beatrice felt the trap, glittering. "And what do you offer in exchange for my captivity?" His voice dropped, roughened by something honest. "Space, truth, and a promise. I will not touch you unless you ask me to." The room seemed to inhale. Beatrice's breath caught, not from tenderness, but from the shocking restraint of it. Her instincts searched for the hidden chain. "Why should I believe you?" Argyll's smile was faint, dangerous. Because if I wanted obedience, Lady Beatrice, I would have chosen someone trained to kneel. Beatrice's spine stayed straight. I will never kneel. I know, he murmured. That is precisely the point. A knock interrupted them. A servant's voice, low and urgent, slipped through the door with the chill of bad news. Your Grace. A message from Scotland. Argyle's expression cooled instantly, the brief warmth vanishing behind ice. He took the note, read it once, and the air around him seemed to sharpen. Beatrice watched his jaw set like a locked gate. What is it? His eyes lifted to hers. And for a heartbeat, the Duke looked less like a man and more like a storm choosing where to strike. Someone, he said softly, has decided our marriage is worth starting a war. The journey north stripped London from Beatrice's skin 1 mile at a time. The city's air, perfumed, sooty, eager with judgment, gave way to something rawer. Wind that tasted of rain, cold that crept beneath wool and lingered like a dare. Even the silence changed. In London, silence was a pause before gossip. Here, it was a presence that watched back. By the time the carriage rolled into the Highlands, the world had turned the colour of steel. Mist lay over the land in slow, deliberate layers, curling around hills like a secret refusing to be told. The road narrowed, then vanished into moor and stone, and Beatrice found herself gripping the seat not from fear, but from irritation at how small she felt beneath so much sky. Argyle sat opposite her with the same controlled stillness he wore in drawing rooms, as if the carriage's jolts were beneath his notice. He read nothing. He did not fidget. He simply looked out, eyes narrowed slightly, taking measure of his territory as though each slope and shadow reported to him. Beatrice leaned forward. Is it always this gloomy, or is Scotland trying to intimidate me personally? His gaze shifted to her, dry as winter. If Scotland wished to intimidate you, Lady Beatrice, it would use something sharper than fog. Like you. Something faint moved in his mouth, almost a smile, almost permission. I am merely an introduction. When the castle emerged, it did not appear so much as assert itself. Dark stone rising from the mist, windows set like watchful eyes, the whole structure crouched against the landscape as though it had been built to endure sieges and heartbreak with equal patience. The air smelled of peat smoke and wet earth, and beneath that, iron, old, quiet, unavoidable. Beatrice stepped down, and the cold met her like a slap that expected gratitude. She lifted her chin anyway. If the castle wanted to swallow her, it would have to chew. Servants formed a line at the entrance, their faces respectful and unreadable, as if emotion were a luxury kept for warmer climates. At their head stood a woman with hair pulled so tightly it looked painful. Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper. Her gaze travelling over Beatrice's travel-worn gown as though measuring the distance between scandal and disaster. Your Grace, Mrs. Caldwell said. Her eyes flicked to Beatrice. Your Duchess. The word landed like a stone in Beatrice's stomach. Duchess, a title with a crown-shaped cage. Beatrice offered a smile bright enough to be dangerous. Don't worry, I bite only when provoked. Mrs. Caldwell's expression did not change. Then we will endeavour never to provoke you, Your Grace. Argyle moved beside Beatrice, close enough that she caught the clean scent of his coat, wool warmed by his body. There are rules, he said quietly, as they crossed the threshold into air that smelled of pine resin and candle smoke. Not for you, for everyone around you. Beatrice arched a brow. How generous, If you walk alone, you will be followed. I hate that already. If you leave the grounds without telling me, men will assume you are a message. A message, she repeated, laughing once. What am I? A letter with legs. Argyle's eyes hardened, humour draining. In the Highlands, everything is a message. Beatrice stopped in the vast entrance hall, where the ceiling disappeared into shadow and the stone floor held the day's cold like a grudge. She turned to face him fully. Do you expect me to behave? No, he said, and the blunt honesty startled her more than any compliment. I expect you to survive. And if I refuse to be protected? Argyle's gaze held hers with that same unsettling steadiness, ice over something deep. Then you will force me to choose between your pride and your pulse. Beatrice felt heat flare behind her ribs. She stepped closer, invading his careful distance. Try choosing my pride for once. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped, just enough for her to see a flash of something human, frustrated, intensely alive. Then it sealed again. A footman appeared, pale and tense, holding out a folded note as if it were dangerous. Your Grace. It arrived by fast rider. Argyle took it, scanned the words, and the air around him seemed to tighten. He did not swear. He did not flinch, but his hand closed on the paper with the quiet violence of restraint. Beatrice's voice softened into sharp curiosity. What does it say? Argyle looked at her, as though weighing whether truth would harm her more than ignorance. Then he handed her the note. The ink was dark and decisive. Deliver the English bride to the old bridge by dawn, or watch your stones burn. Beatrice read it twice. Then she lifted her head, slow, and smiled. How unoriginal, she murmured. They threaten fire, as if I've never met men with small imaginations. Argyle's eyes locked onto hers, colder now, and far more dangerous. Do not treat this as sport, he said. Beatrice folded the note with deliberate care. Then stop marrying women who enjoy games, Your Grace. And somewhere beyond the thick walls, the wind rose, dragging the fog across the land like a curtain about to lift. Morning in Argyle did not coax. It commanded. Cold slipped under doors and into bones, carrying the scent of peat and wet pine, as if the world itself had been rinsed clean of softness. Beatrice woke to the unfamiliar weight of silence. No London wheels, no neighbourly clatter, only wind worrying the stone and distant water speaking in a language she did not yet understand. She dressed without asking permission, no corset, no surrender, a simple gown that allowed her lungs to belong to her. When Mrs. Caldwell appeared, eyes sharp as pins, Beatrice gave her a bright smile and tightened her own ribbon with deliberate calm. His Grace requests you remain indoors, the housekeeper said, each word measured. Beatrice sipped her tea. It was smoky, almost bitter, and it warmed her like defiance. His Grace may request the moon to descend into his hand as well. Mrs. Caldwell's mouth barely moved. The Highlands are not London. No, Beatrice agreed. In London, people pretend to be civilized while sharpening knives behind fans. Here, at least, the knives sound honest. She walked anyway, through corridors that smelled of wax and old stone, until she reached the great hall. Men had gathered there with the uneasy posture of those who carried weapons beneath good coats. Their voices were low, clipped, edged with urgency. When Beatrice entered, the talk stuttered into silence. And then she saw him. Laird Fergus Kincaid stood near the fire with the confidence of a man who mistook arrogance for birthright. He was handsome in a hard, polished way, eyes bright with calculation. His smile arrived before his manners, the sort that tried to claim a woman's attention as if it were owed. "So," he said, loud enough to be heard and daring enough to be cruel, "this is the English bride." Beatrice stepped forward, unhurried. "And you must be the man who believes introductions are optional." A few men shifted, as if expecting a blow. Kincaid's gaze dragged over her, evaluating, reducing. "You look smaller than the stories." Beatrice tilted her head. "And you look louder than your usefulness." A sound escaped someone, half laugh, half choke. Kincaid's smile sharpened. Argyle has expensive tastes, or perhaps he simply bought what he could. Beatrice's pulse stayed steady. She leaned in just enough to make her words intimate. "If you think I can be bought, Laird Kincaid, you've never met a woman who values her own teeth." The air tightened. Then Alistair entered, and the room's temperature seemed to drop a degree. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence rearranged attention the way gravity rearranged dust. "Kincaid," he said, flat as a drawn blade. "My Duke," Kincaid replied, the title sweetened with mockery. "I came to offer congratulations and condolences." Beatrice watched Alistair's jaw flex once, a flicker of strain beneath the ice. His gaze found her, and for a moment she saw it, control fighting something far more volatile. He spoke without looking away from her. "Lady Beatrice, inside." Beatrice smiled as if he had invited her to a dance. "You fear for me." "I calculate risk," he corrected. "How romantic." A muscle jumped in his cheek. For a heartbeat, she thought he might snap. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, one short, unwilling sound that was dangerously close to laughter. It delighted her. She left the hall on her own terms, but she did not go where they expected. She slipped past a side door and into the open air, letting the wind slap colour into her cheeks. The moor stretched wide and indifferent. Mist curled and retreated. Somewhere, water ran over stone with relentless patience. A gust seized her hat and flung it like an insult across the grass. Beatrice ran after it, skirts gathered in her hands, laughing once, sharp, startled at the absurdity of being chased by her own clothing. Rain began as a whisper, then thickened, cold needles tapping her skin. She caught the hat at last, triumphant and damp, and found Alistair standing behind her. His coat was dark with rain at the shoulders, his expression carved from restraint. He looked as though he had tracked her the way men tracked threats. "I told you not to leave," he said. Beatrice lifted the hat in greeting. "You did. I declined. You could have been taken. I could be taken in a ballroom too," she shot back, breath visible in the cold. "At least here I can see the sky." His eyes moved over her, not indulgent, not admiring, checking, counting. "You don't understand what they'll do." Beatrice stepped closer, rain sliding down her hair. "Then explain it without ordering me." For a moment, he said nothing. Then his hand rose, not to claim, but to steady her elbow as the wind shoved hard. The touch was brief, controlled, yet it sent a strange heat through her ribs. "They think you're leverage," he said quietly, "a way to make me bleed." Beatrice's smile returned, slow and bright. "Then they'll be disappointed." They walked back with the rain thickening around them, the castle looming like a patient beast. At the door, a servant waited, pale-faced, holding out a second message. Alistair took it, read it. His eyes went darker. Beatrice didn't ask. She simply held out her hand. After a pause, one heartbeat of struggle, he gave her the note. This time, the ink was blunt. Bring her to the old bridge by dawn. Come alone, or we start with the stables. Beatrice folded the paper neatly and looked up at her husband with a calm that felt like a dare. Dawn? She said softly. How inconvenient. Alistair's voice dropped to something dangerous. You will not be there. Beatrice's eyes glittered. And if I decide I'm tired of being the thing everyone moves around the board? Behind them, the wind howled against the stone, as if the highlands themselves were listening for her answer. By dusk, the castle had changed its breathing. Doors that had once stood politely open now shut with decisive clicks. Footsteps multiplied in the corridors, measured, purposeful. Men moving as if the stone itself had issued orders. The air smelled of damp wool, oil from lanterns, and something sharper beneath it, the metallic tang of readiness. Beatrice felt it in the way servants avoided her eyes, in the way conversations stopped mid-syllable when she entered, in the way even the fire seemed to burn more cautiously. Alistair did not raise his voice. He never needed to. His commands travelled faster than sound, passed hand to hand like coins no one dared refuse. No one leaves the grounds, he told the household at supper, gaze sweeping the table as if counting liabilities. No one rides out. No one answers strangers. If you hear a knock after dark, you wake me before you breathe. Beatrice sat opposite him, her spoon suspended above broth that smelled of herbs and smoke. Before I breathe, she repeated, sweetly. How considerate. I'll try to schedule my lungs. A few servants stared down at their plates, terrified of laughter. Alistair's eyes flicked to her. A warning, a plea, a threat, she couldn't tell which, and it infuriated her. This is not a game. Beatrice set the spoon down with soft precision. Everything becomes a game when men insist on moving me like a piece. His jaw tightened. I am trying to keep you alive. And I am trying, she said, leaning forward, to keep myself mine. Silence stretched. Candlelight trembled. The wind pressed against the windows as if it wanted in. Later, in the corridor outside her rooms, Alistair caught her before she could slip away. The castle's stone held the day's cold, and the torchlight threw hard shadows across his face, sharpening the angles of restraint. You will stay in your rooms tonight, he said. The door will be guarded. Beatrice's laugh was quiet and bright. Guarded? How romantic. Shall you also chain me to the bedpost and call it devotion? His expression barely moved. Don't make me regret marrying you. Oh, I intend to, she replied, and stepped closer until she felt the heat of him through the space he tried to keep. But not in the way you mean. For an instant, something cracked behind his eyes. An answer he refused to speak. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a small key. It glinted in the torchlight like a confession. Beatrice's gaze dropped to it. So it is a lock. It is a precaution. It is a cage, she corrected, and held out her hand. Give it to me. He hesitated. The world seemed to wait on that hesitation. Servants, guards, even the wind. You would open it, he said. I would decide, she replied. Alistair's fingers closed around the key so tightly his knuckles paled. When he finally placed it in her palm, his touch lingered a fraction too long. Controlled, restrained, yet unmistakably real. You are reckless, he murmured. Beatrice curled her fingers around the key until it pressed into her skin. and you are terrified. His mouth tightened. Of losing you. The words landed between them like a dropped match. Beatrice's breath caught, not because she believed him blindly, but because something in his voice sounded unpracticed, honest. He had built an empire on control, and she had forced him into a sentence that didn't fit his mouth. She lifted her chin. Then stop trying to own my fear. A shout echoed from somewhere below, short, urgent, followed by the heavy thud of running boots. The castle's quiet snapped like a string. Alistair turned sharply, all warmth extinguished. A guard appeared at the end of the corridor, face taut. "Your Grace," he said, voice strained. "They're at the east wall, and there's fire." Alistair's gaze locked back onto Beatrice, dark, decisive. "Stay here." Beatrice's smile returned, slow as a drawn blade. Or what? And as the alarm bells began to ring, she slipped the key into her pocket like a promise she hadn't decided how to keep. Night did not end with the alarm. It merely changed shape. Smoke threaded through the lower corridors in thin, bitter ribbons, carrying the scorched scent of hay and pitch. Somewhere beyond the walls, men shouted names that sounded like curses, and the wind answered with a howl that made the castle's windows tremble in their frames. Beatrice stood at her door with the key burning a warm circle in her pocket, listening to the house move like a living thing. Guards running, servants whispering prayers, steel scraping softly against stone. Alistair returned near dawn with rain on his shoulders and darkness in his eyes. His coat was damp, his hair slightly disordered, and there was a smear of blood on his cuff that did not belong on any nobleman's sleeve. He halted when he saw her waiting, as if the sight of her forced him to remember what all this violence was trying to protect. "You should have been inside," he said. Beatrice's gaze went to the blood. "You should have been less dramatic." His mouth tightened. "It was not drama." "Then what was it?" she asked, voice quiet and sharp. "A greeting, a courtship custom of the Highlands." For a heartbeat, something like exhaustion flickered beneath his control. "It was a warning," he said. "They want you frightened enough to beg me for the cage." Beatrice leaned closer, just enough to make him feel her defiance. "I don't beg." "I know," he replied, and the words carried an edge that sounded dangerously like admiration. "That is why they will escalate." Beatrice's laugh was small, almost tender in its cruelty. Men always do, when a woman refuses to tremble prettily. He studied her face as if searching for cracks, then spoke with a low precision. "Kincaid is pushing the clans to test me. If I look weak, they will come for my land. If I look careless, they will come for you." "And if you look cruel?" Beatrice asked. His eyes held hers. "Then they will think twice." Beatrice's lips curved. "You were born for that part." He did not deny it. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded paper, dry now, but creased like it had been crushed in a fist. He placed it in her hand without ceremony. Beatrice opened it and read the blunt ink. "One bride for one stable. Refuse." And we moved to the house. Her pulse stayed steady out of spite. "They write like men who've never met a woman with a temper." Alistair's gaze sharpened. "This is not a duel of cleverness." "No," Beatrice said, folding the note with meticulous care. "It's a duel of attention." His brow barely shifted. "Explain." Beatrice lifted her chin, eyes bright behind the calm. "They want you hiding. They want your household afraid, your allies uncertain, your enemies bold. So stop shrinking your world around me like I'm fragile porcelain." Alistair's voice was flat. You are not porcelain. Exactly, Beatrice said. So give them what they can't ignore. A pause. The wind pressed against the stone. Somewhere below, a servant sobbed quietly, the sound swallowed by thick walls. You want a spectacle, he said at last. I want a message, Beatrice corrected. And since you said everything here is a message, let's speak loudly. Alistair watched her as if she were a fuse he hadn't decided whether to light. What are you proposing? Beatrice smiled, quick and wicked. A ball. His expression did not change, but the air around him seemed to harden. A ball after an attack. Perfect timing, she said. Nothing terrifies cowards like music and witnesses. Alistair's gaze dropped to her mouth for a fraction too long, then rose again, cold reassembled. If I do this, it is because it draws them out. Beatrice's voice softened into a dare. And because you can't stand being told no. A sound escaped him, too short to be laughter, too real to be nothing. You are impossible. I'm married to you, Beatrice replied. I had to be. When the invitations went out, the castle changed again. Candles multiplied. Floors were polished until they shone like dark water. Silk arrived in boxes, wine in crates, musicians in cautious clusters. Servants moved with strained brightness, as if pretending hard enough could charm danger into manners. On the night of the ball, Beatrice dressed like an act of rebellion made elegant. No corset, a gown that skimmed rather than constrained, its fabric whispering against her skin like a secret. She stepped into the lit corridors and felt eyes turn, fearful, curious, reverent. Alistair waited for her near the great hall. He looked carved from shadow and authority, but when his gaze found her, the mask faltered at the edges. You are determined to start wars, he murmured. Beatrice lifted her chin. Only the ones I intend to win. They entered together, and conversation rippled, then steadied into a tense hum. Laughter sounded too high, smiles too careful. Kincaid arrived with the grace of a snake dressed as a gentleman, bowing with polished insolence. My Duke, he said, then turned to Beatrice. Your Grace, I'm relieved you survived. Scotland would miss its newest ornament. Beatrice's smile widened. Ornament? How disappointing. I was hoping to be a weapon. Kincaid's eyes glittered. Weapons can be taken. Beatrice leaned closer, voice silken. Only by men who live long enough to try. Music swelled. Dancing began. Alistair's hand found the small of her back, firm, possessive, protective. And for a moment, the danger blurred into something else. Heat beneath restraint, breath close to ear, the taste of risk in every shared glance. Then Beatrice noticed it. A servant she did not recognize moved along the wall, too careful, too watchful, fingers hidden in the folds of an apron. A glint of metal flashed near the drapery, quick as a wink. Beatrice's pulse did not spike. It sharpened. She turned her head slightly toward Alistair and spoke without moving her lips much, as if the words were part of the dance. Your enemy is here, she murmured, and he didn't come to waltz. Beatrice kept her smile as the music carried on, light and bright as a lie. Around them, silk swished and laughter rose in careful waves, the kind that existed only because everyone agreed not to mention the smell of smoke still clinging to the castle's stones. But Beatrice's attention narrowed to the unfamiliar servant moving along the wall with a patience that did not belong to honest labour. Alistair's hand tightened at her waist. One silent question. Beatrice answered by stepping into the next turn of the dance, as if she were simply enjoying herself. Her spectacles were gone tonight, but her vision had never been sharper. She noted how the servant avoided the cluster of guards, how his shoulders stayed too squared for a housemaid's posture, how his gaze kept flicking toward the drapery where a hard glint had flashed. A weapon, or the promise of one. Beatrice angled her chin toward Kincaid, who stood near the edge of the crowd, glass in hand, watching as if he were waiting for a punchline. He raised his drink in a lazy salute, too relaxed for a man who claimed loyalty. Beatrice leaned closer to Alistair, voice barely more than breath. He wants you to react, loudly. Alistair's tone stayed even. I will end him. Not yet, she murmured. First, let him ruin himself. Alistair's gaze cut to her, sharp with disbelief and something else, something like reluctant respect. What are you planning? Beatrice's smile did not change. A scandal, the kind that bites. She slipped from Alistair's hold with practiced grace, letting the dance carry her away as if she were simply drawn by the room's rhythm. She moved toward the drapery in a slow arc, greeting guests with bright remarks, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, offering her hand here and there so no one would suspect her purpose. She made herself visible on her own terms, never hurried, never hunted. Near the curtains, she stumbled. It was a performance so convincing, even the nearest lady gasped. Beatrice's skirt caught a chair leg, her body tipped, and her hand flew out, straight into the heavy folds of fabric. Her fingers closed around something cold and wrong, metal, oiled, hidden too neatly to be innocent. She fell fully, dragging the drapery with her in a soft roar of fabric. A small device clattered onto the floor, dark, ugly, unmistakably made for harm. The music stuttered. Conversation snapped off. Silence surged through the hall like ice water. Beatrice sat up slowly, hair slightly loosened, cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment, but with triumph. She held the device between two fingers as if it were a dead insect. "Oh dear," she said, bright as a bell. "Has someone misplaced their courage?" A ripple of uneasy sound moved through the guests. Guards surged forward. The unfamiliar servant stiffened, then turned, too late. Alistair crossed the floor with a calm that made the moment terrifying. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply arrived, and the room's fear rearranged itself around him. His gaze dropped to the device in Beatrice's hand, then lifted to the servant's face. "Take him," Alistair said. The man lunged for the nearest door. Two guards intercepted him. A brief struggle, the scrape of boots, the wet grunt of panic. Then he was pinned, swearing in a dialect rough with desperation. Kincaid began to step back, as if distance could absolve him. Beatrice rose, smoothing her skirt as though she had merely corrected a hem. She turned her head and fixed Kincaid with a look that felt like a lock clicking shut. "Leaving so soon?" she asked gently. "But I was just about to toast your loyalty." Kincaid's smile tried to survive. "Your Grace is confused." Beatrice lifted the device higher. "Am I? Then perhaps you can explain why your man hid this behind my curtains." Kincaid's eyes flashed, rage slipping through polish, before he forced them smooth again. "Slander." Alistair's voice cut through the hall, low and final. "It isn't slander when it's in my house." Kincaid opened his mouth, then stopped, because the guests were watching, and fear had shifted sides. His bravado wilted under the weight of witness. The mask slid. For the first time, he looked like what he was. a man who mistook arrogance for armor. Beatrice stepped close enough to speak for Kincaid alone. "You threatened stables," she whispered. "Next time, threaten something you can actually take." Kincaid's face tightened. Then he spat a word and wrenched free of courtesy, storming toward the exit under the guard's eyes. His defeat tasted sweet in the air, sharp as wine, clean as winter. Only when the hall began to breathe again did Beatrice feel the tremor in her own fingers, adrenaline, not fear. She tucked the shaking into her spine and lifted her chin. Alistair appeared beside her, too close, his voice lowered. "You could have been killed." Beatrice's smile was thin. "But I wasn't." His gaze raked over her as if to confirm she was real, then halted on her mouth. The mask held, until it didn't. He lifted a hand, knuckles brushing her cheek with a restraint that felt like a confession. "You are infuriating," he murmured. "And you're welcome," Beatrice replied, trying for levity, trying to keep the ground steady. Alistair did not answer with words. He leaned in and kissed her, sudden and controlled all at once, as if he had decided this was the only language honest enough for what surged beneath his ice. Heat flared through her, surprise, anger, delight. Then she gripped his coat and returned it with the same fierce precision she brought to every fight. She broke away first, breath unsteady, eyes bright with challenge. "That," she said, voice low, "was not gratitude." Alistair's gaze darkened, the smallest smile cutting at the corner of his mouth. "No," he whispered, "that was me losing." News travelled faster than carriages when it was sharpened into rumour. By the time Beatrice and Alistair returned south, London had already decided what kind of woman a Highland Duchess must be, either a conquered prize or a shameless opportunist. The city greeted her with familiar perfume, flowers forced open in warm rooms, and the familiar stench beneath it, coal smoke, damp stone, and the hunger of people who could not bear to witness a woman choosing anything. The Wickham townhouse looked unchanged, yet Beatrice felt the difference immediately. The servants' eyes darted away too quickly. The silence in the corridors wasn't respectful, it was listening. Even the air seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for her to collapse into obedience. Alistair moved through it like a storm contained in a tailored coat. He spoke little on the journey, but Beatrice had learned to read the tension in his stillness. London irritated him. Not because it was loud, he had enemies louder than this, but because its cruelty wore gloves and called itself virtue. At the first gathering, the smiles were polished to a gleam. Compliments fell like petals with pins hidden inside. A lady admired Beatrice's gown with the same tone one used to praise a dog that had learned a trick. A gentleman asked Alistair about savage customs with delighted condescension. Beatrice answered each insult with a sweetness that made people laugh before they realized they were the target. But beneath the comedy, pressure tightened. Alistair's hand on her back became more frequent, more firm, as if he could steer the world away from her with enough force. He began to speak for her in small ways, subtle corrections, brief interruptions, choices presented as kindness. Beatrice smiled through it until the smile began to ache. "You're doing it again," she murmured to him in a quiet corner, where candlelight softened the edges of their faces, but not the tension between them. "Doing what?" His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made it worse. "Building walls around me," she said, "calling them protection." Alistair's gaze sharpened. "You saw what happens when they get close." "And you saw what happens when I handle it," Beatrice replied, chin lifted. "You don't get to lock me up simply because the world is ugly." His jaw flexed once. "I don't want you bruised by this city. I'm not glass. she said, the words crisp with old fury. "Stop treating me like something that breaks." The argument didn't explode. It tightened, coiling into something dangerous and private. His restraint turned rigid. Her defiance turned colder. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man used to being obeyed. "You don't understand what's at stake." Beatrice's eyes flashed. "I understand perfectly. Men decide what women can endure, then call it love when we don't complain." Silence struck between them, hard as a slap. She left him there, tall, immovable, furious in stillness, and stepped out into the foggy street as if daring London to witness her breathing free. The air tasted wet and metallic, and the lamplight made halos out of mist. Somewhere nearby, laughter spilled from a carriage like careless champagne. Then a paper fluttered against her skirt, a pamphlet, cheap and eager, ink still sharp. Beatrice's eyes skimmed the title and felt her stomach drop into cold clarity. A Highland duke bought his bride, and she paid with her virtue. Her hand stayed steady as she read the vile little story. Hints of seduction, greed, scandal dressed up as moral concern. The words were meant to shame her into silence. They were meant to make him ashamed of her. Footsteps sounded behind her. Alistair's shadow fell across the page. His hand closed around the pamphlet, crumpling it once, violently contained. When he spoke, his voice was low enough to be intimate and dangerous. "Tell me this is a lie." Beatrice lifted her gaze to his, rain beginning to bead on her lashes like tiny accusations. "And if it's true," she said softly, pride bleeding into pain, "will you try to lock me up again?" The fog clung to London like a spiteful secret, beading on Beatrice's lashes and turning every lamplight into a blurred accusation. Alistair stood before her, with the crumpled pamphlet in his fist, his composure strained to its final thread. He looked like a man who could buy courts and crush rivals, yet had no idea how to speak when the enemy was a sentence printed on cheap paper. Beatrice held his gaze without flinching. She had been judged by quieter rooms than this, sentenced by softer voices. The city wanted her lowered. It wanted her grateful for protection. It wanted her ashamed. Alistair's voice came again, rougher now. "Tell me what you meant." Beatrice's mouth curved, too sharp to be kind. "I meant you don't own the truth about me." His jaw tightened. "I don't want the truth owned. I want it safe." "And I want it mine," she replied, each word steady as a step toward a cliff. "If you can't love a woman who chooses her own scandal, then you married the wrong one." Something dark flickered behind his eyes. Anger, fear, something far older than pride. Then, slowly, his hand unclenched. The pamphlet fell into the wet street, ink bleeding into nothing. He exhaled as if letting go of a weapon he'd used too long. "Tell me what you want," he said, quieter. Not an order, not a bargain, a surrender dressed in restraint. Beatrice blinked once, the sting in her eyes more than fog. "I want to speak." The next evening, the Wickham townhouse filled until the walls seemed to strain. Ladies arrived in polished curiosity, men in eager moral outrage. The air smelled of hot wax, perfume and anticipation, like a match waiting for friction. Beatrice stood at the centre of it without armour, but her own spine. Alistair hovered near the edge, implacable, a shadow that could become violence if anyone touched her wrong. Beatrice caught his eye and lifted her chin as if to say, "Not yet." When the murmurs peaked, she stepped forward. "London enjoys stories," she began, voice carrying without effort. "Because stories let you pretend you are not cruel. But I've read your little pamphlet. and I must confess, it is terribly written." A ripple of laughter escaped despite itself. Beatrice continued, sweet and merciless. "It says I sold myself, that I schemed, that I trapped a duke. How flattering to imagine I require a man's title to be dangerous." More laughter, then unease, the kind that tasted like guilt. "I did not marry to be rescued," she said, and her tone cooled. "I married because I chose the lesser of two prisons, and then I decided to renovate. If you cannot bear a woman who breathes freely, then stop inviting her into your parlors, only to suffocate her with your approval." Silence fell, heavy and shocked. A voice rose, thin, offended. "A lady should—" Alistair stepped forward before Beatrice could answer. The movement alone quieted the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "My wife should do as she pleases," he said, and the words landed like a door being kicked open. "If any of you cannot stomach that, then choke elsewhere." Beatrice felt the room sway, society's certainty cracking under the weight of a duke refusing to control his duchess. She turned to him, eyes bright with challenge and something softer underneath. "So you'll let me choose?" Alistair held her gaze as if it cost him. "I will," he said, "even when your choices frighten me." Beatrice's smile warmed, finally honest. "Good, because I intend to frighten them more." He reached for her hand, not to restrain, but to join. His thumb pressed once against her knuckles. A quiet vow. Beatrice stood unbroken, chosen and choosing.